Something you'll typically find nowadays is that game developers, specifically in the AAA space, don't really branch out anymore. They're known for one genre and that genre alone, and honestly, that makes sense. Games cost a lot to make nowadays, and the investment needed to move outside of their wheelhouse is probably astronomical for no guarantee of return. This mentality is actually part of why I think the industry is failing, but that's not why we're here, and it wasn't always the case. Because up until the middle of the 7th generation, they were still just throwing ideas at the wall to see what sticks, and sometimes they really did. Criterion, famous for racing games, tried their hand at shooters and created Black, a sleeper cult classic. Naughty Dog, known for platformers, made a rather competent GTA game, and Rare just made everything, and we love them for it. But to me, there's none more bizarre than Creative Assembly. They're a studio made famous by the Total War games, but they also made Alien Isolation, a really bloody good survival horror, and arguably one of the best video game adaptations that franchise has ever had. They were also behind Hyenas, the extraction shooter that by a lot of accounts was actually pretty decent, but ultimately got canned for profitability reasons. But then, way back in the day, they also created a big old Greek hack and slash epic that I don't think gets enough recognition for what it actually tried to do. I am the resident gremlin, purveyor of the weird, the retro, and the forgotten, and today we're looking at Spartan Total Warrior, a game weirdly ahead of its time. The game takes place in sort of ancient Greece, where the Roman Empire has control over the entirety of the country, except, naturally, the warrior state of Sparta. But the Spartans have had severe losses, and all that's left are the newbies and the untested. And among these generic recruits, we have the main characters of Castor Pollux and the player character, the unnamed Spartan, who everyone just calls the Spartan, or Spartan for short. This should probably cause some confusion, but it seems to be the general consensus that he's the only one they call that. Thankfully, despite having no name or memory of his past, he is super good at Spartaning, so Ares offers to aid him against the Romans in return for assisting with his revenge. Who against? Doesn't matter, because the Romans are here and they are all British for some reason.
It is time to complete our conquest of Greece.
Probably to offset the Spartans being American. And this being Spartan fiction, of course we have to have the iconic line.
Done.
Good. We shall have our battle in the shade.
First mission is pretty simple. The Romans are sieging the walls of Sparta, and you have to drive them off. First section is repairing the siege towers and serves as the game's main tutorial. X is the normal combo attack and your bread and butter for the game. Circle performs a charged radial attack. It doesn't appear to do more damage, but it hits more people, which is nice. L2 blocks and blocks most everything, but also converts attacks into shield bashes. X is a single bash and Circle is a wide bash, and these two are stupidly important because outside of the archers, every enemy can and will block your attacks, which make you blink off their shields and leaves you open to attack, and there are almost always more of them than there are of you. Additionally, the radial shield bash is for clearing space, and space is something you're going to need in this game. As you attack enemies and deal damage, this bar in the corner fills up. This is your rage bar, and filling it allows you to use a rage move with R1. Again, X is a single target and Circle is AoE, however 98% of the time you're going to be using the Circle option purely because it hits more things and typically one-shots most basic enemies. Finally, we have the bow. Triggered with L1 and functions the same way as everything else previously mentioned, and unlike a lot of games of this type, the bow actually does damage. The trade-off is a limited ammunition, but there's also fire arrow power-ups that appear somewhat frequently in missions, which just do so much damage. Finally, square is the all-purpose action button for interacting with things, using the shrines to heal, and also coup de gracing downed enemies. Triangle is jump, but you'll probably use this a couple times when it's required because it's otherwise useless. Roll's pretty decent though. After dealing with the Centurions leading the attack, sappers will spawn and you'll have to escort them to the towers to destroy them. It's short and not particularly hard, but we get a taste of what it could end up being. Afterwards, we just sprint to the next courtyard, where we have to protect the main gate while also protecting King Leonidas, or Leonidas as the game likes to say. However, this can be a bit difficult because Leo likes to hang out on the opposite side of the arena to the gate, so you are constantly having to run back and forth between the two in hopes that the hordes of Roman soldiers will just mulch either of them. It's actually weirdly stressful for the literal first mission. After that's done, you and the boys run to the front gate just in time to see the statue of Talos marching on it. This game is not grounded in reality, by the way. Also, Roman sappers are trying to destroy the gate as well, so you have to use a cauldron to destroy the sappers, and kill the soldiers trying to destroy the cauldron, so you can hold out long enough to fire all 3 catapults to knock Talus out of commission. It's hectic, but somehow in all the right ways, like an actual melee. After that, Leonidas dryly chews out the Spartan for letting the statue land on a building, and warns that the Romans aren't done yet, before walking off in an epic bloom transition, like you're watching the end of a TV episode. It's beautifully theatrical, and I'm honestly here for it. And gameplay-wise, the first mission covers pretty much everything the game has to offer. They mix it up here and there and add a few extra bells and whistles, but at a baseline it's escort, defend, destroy. So if you enjoyed this, you'll enjoy the vast majority of the rest of the game, probably. Anyway, at the start of each mission you're given points to upgrade your stats. It's pretty rudimentary, with only 2 options being health, which visibly increases your health, and damage, which probably does something, maybe. Mission 1-2 starts with Ares telling the Spartan to sneak into the Roman encampment to take back the Blades of Athena. Why they brought the blades to the front lines just to leave them there, I don't know, and you shouldn't worry about it. Pollux is against the idea, but Protag says we're doing it. And this is a stealth mission, or as near as damn it. The game has some very basic detection mechanics when it wants to, and because of this mission is kind of slow, but oddly enough, it isn't to its detriment. Slowing the gameplay down, lowering the pace, actually helps with games like this, because balancing intensity with proper highs and lows stops the game from feeling like the same mission over and over again, and driving players away as a result, which is also helped by the much narrower paths that make up the level. This is also the mission where the game teaches you 2 very important lessons. Firstly, gravity is a thing and will kill you if you do not respect its authority. Secondly, this game is evil when you don't have your Spartan boys with you. The game is very much designed primarily for these big skirmishes with dozens of dudes each side, so when you strip one side down to 2 to 3 combatants, it becomes a really rough time if you try to play it like a lunatic and not tactically. Thankfully, due to these levels' somewhat compact nature, most encounters aren't massive, and the rudimentary quasi-stealth mechanics mean you can lower that frustration further. Isn't it nice when the game's design is informed? This is also the level where they introduce side objectives, specifically in this case contaminating their water supply, before promptly forgetting about them for most of the game. There's no grand benefit from completing them outside of collectibles, so they're kind of just there for completion's sake, so them being sidelined isn't particularly hard to fathom. Also, fun fact, I remember this side objective being him pissing in the water. Not sure why, brain be like that sometimes. A few patrols later and we reach the altar where the blades are held, and we take them just in time for a mysterious woman to show up, followed by even more Romans, which is a great time to break in these new weapons. They are much faster than your standard sword and shield, their circle rage move has massive clearing potential and also unlocks Power of the Gods, basically just magic attacks based on the weapon. R2 and X will circle. For the Blades of Athena you can blast the area around you with electricity, or just pump it all into one poor bastard of your choice. And with this new weapon you can now switch back to the basic weapon with the D-pad, and I've got to hand it to Creative Assembly for making full use of the controller. That sounds weird, but you'd be surprised how often devs of the generation had unused buttons, or really odd shortcuts that feel designed for spider people. After that, it's a case of freeing the prisoners next door and escorting them to safety. And I do mean escort, because if you lose all of the first group you free, it's game over and you have to start again, as you'd expect. The second group can seemingly bite it though, which is odd, but eventually you escape to the outskirts of Sparta where the rest of the guys are waiting. And of course, the entire Roman army is after you. So the climax of the mission is defending the prisoners as hundreds of soldiers barrel down the hill, and you just get to blast them with oddly advanced explosive ballistae. It is bonkers fun. As the mission ends, the Spartan and co get chewed out by Electra, the princess of the Amazons, who has a peculiar accent that jumps between kinda Greek and extremely Welsh.
Ambushed after the fall of Athens, I delayed the Romans long enough for most of my sisters to escape.
Who tells you that she's been following the Romans across Greece and warns that they have a new weapon they're planning to use on Sparta. And of course that weapon is the Medusa cannon, which they will use to turn the Spartan armies to stone. This is not an historically accurate game, the Talos statue and the magic sword should have tipped you off. Also, between levels you can now upgrade your power. I think it makes your power of the god stronger, but if it does, it's really hard to tell. Anyway, you need to destroy the Medusa cannon, but there are ballistae in the entire Roman army between you and that objective. A lot of this mission is focused on level destruction. Rather than walking from arena to arena like the first mission, you constantly have to demolish your way through ballista emplacements, archer towers, and a crumbling cityscape just to progress. And that's not even what the mission really highlights. What it's really highlighting is Spartan Total War's eye for scale, because as you're doing this, there is an actual fight going on in the background. But the thing is, that isn't the background. That isn't baked in. That's actually happening in real time. You see, a fun fact about this game is that it originally started life as an attempt to bring the Total War franchise to consoles, and anyone with a basic understanding of those games would know how much of an ask that is. Total War battles are/were such a massive scale that the consoles of the time were never going to be able to handle it. This being the case, they did the only reasonable thing and built an entire engine in 6 months. They built an entire engine from scratch for this game, starting with a tech demo of 300 dudes running over a hill from 750 meters away, or whatever that means in a game engine, and with a stable 60 FPS. And while over the rest of the 3-year development period that got narrowed down to 170 NPCs, that is no less impressive, because while they downsized the cap on on-screen NPCs, the NPCs have robust AI for pathfinding, target selection and combat decisions, specifically so they don't just mindlessly beeline to the player every single fight. And beyond that, there's no pop-in, no fogging, rendering a kilometer-wide environment, all at a still mostly smooth 60 FPS. Sure, there's some frame drops in the most congested fights, but to pull all of this off on the weakest console of the generation is still an insane feat. Can we get back to this? Screw rendering each individual hair on some dude's scrotum, give me more massive battles and populated cities. Well, gushing done, now where were we? Oh yes, General Crassus. Not only does he have the Medusa cannon, he also has the Medusa shield, which allows him to channel that power into his weapons, which means he also has magic and can turn you to stone. Luckily it's not an instant kill unless you're jumping for some reason, but this is a boss fight and it's technically an ad fight, which would normally be to its detriment. However, this works because the entire game is built on the melee, so he just feels like a priority target in a mass of enemies. What also helps is that he has to recharge his magic rather than just having an infinite supply of it, and to do this he calls the Medusa laser down on himself to get more, petrifying everything in the area, including his own allies. Ultimately, it isn't a difficult fight, but it feels like an epic battle. You also get the Medusa shield out of it, which replaces your standard weapon, but you don't get to play with that until next mission. Afterwards, Ares congratulates the Spartan on a job well done, but also tells him he has more work to do to stop the Empire, and he'll need to get the Spear of Achilles from its resting place in Troy to have any chance of succeeding, and that him and the gang need to leave immediately and not tell Leonidas at all. Why? Stop asking questions. And so off we pop into Act 2-1 and the Badlands, where we have to fight a horde of barbarians, and there really isn't anything special about these guys. They're similar enough to the Roman soldiers, only they aren't anywhere near as regimented and are much more aggressive, so fights become utter brawls. However, it does give us time to talk about the Medusa shield. Exact same as the basic sword and shield, but magic is where it shines, because it's kinda broken. X turns a single target to stone, not much to write home about, but the AoE option is where this all comes together. The Spartan fires all that petrification stuff into the air, hitting all enemies in the area. Not on screen, not around the Spartan, every single enemy in the scene. This is a global stun. You can imagine how much power in a game where 100-man skirmishes are expected, the ability to turn off one entire enemy force is. Pair this with the Blades of Athena's AoE rage attack, and you can clear a lot of encounters stupidly fast, and it's probably the most broken combo in the entire game. Otherwise, the mission is simply burning down camps and blowing up caves, right up until you reach where the barbarians are keeping the villagers, where you have to fight the Gigante, a big beefy boy that's super tanky and will grab you if you are anywhere close to him. Even behind. It's kind of bloody annoying. They also explode into meaty chunks when defeated. Not sure why, but hey. Beat the rest of the barbarians and we decide to split the gang. Castor and Pollux go to Troy, and the Spartan and Electra will go to the nearby town to destroy the barbarian horde once and for all. Wow, only 2 missions in and full exterminations on the cards. Also, we're not the Bow of Artemis for completing 2-1. No idea why, you just do. Enjoy. 2-2 is theoretically one of the shortest missions in the game. Theoretically. Your job is to protect the town. Simple stuff. Mission starts with Beowulf because the barbarians are Danes just roaming around the Greek countryside apparently, calling out the Spartan to fight, before immediately sicking his berserker guards on him because he's not worth his time. Gabe wants you to kick the berserkers into the fire here, but Medusa's shield works just as well, after it eventually hits the dudes in the ring of fire because it targets everything. Everything. Do that and retreat into the town, and this is where the game takes off the kid gloves and pulls out the tire iron. The game now wants you to protect the 2 grain silos from the oncoming horde. This is a nightmare. Because you have to protect both at the same time, you only have a handful of guys to help you. Said guys aren't enough to stop the barbarians destroying the silos, so you have to do basically all of the legwork. And the enemies will not recognise your existence until you hit them, so you end up having to try to meat shield the objective most of the time. Thankfully, the Bow of Artemis lets you just shoot chain lightning around the battlefield. Doesn't do a lot of damage, but it stuns for a bit, making it a more damage-focused version of the Medusa shield. And to top it all off, the last wave is 2 Gigante, which is kind of a ball ache, and because of the aforementioned meat shielding, you'll probably die over and over and over again. I am not joking when I say this is probably the second worst level in the game, and I do not judge people if they bounced off it. But after several resets and maybe a cursory call to your therapist, you move on to protecting the villagers, which is a lot easier than it actually sounds, before finally moving on to fight Beowulf, and god do I hate this fight. You can't block him because all his attacks guard break, and you can't shield bash him to create an opening because he recovers too fast. Your only real option is to roll his attacks and get around him to hit him from behind, but it doesn't give you much of a window there either. And his magic is completely unblockable, so you have to jump it. One of 3 known uses of the jump button. The dude will also call in berserkers to help him and will throw fireballs which you can stop by shooting him with arrows. If you have any. I didn't. It is a rough fight because if you don't know it's coming, you're probably not prepared. But thankfully, it is the only one in the game like this. And once you finally beat him, you get Deathbiter. Arguably the worst weapon in the game. It's slow, has none of the AoE or range you'd expect from a big heavy hammer. Its magic is extremely short range and you can quite easily be staggered out of the attack animation way too often. The only redeeming quality is how fast it generates rage and how it can break guard and destroy shields. Sadly, everything before and after just outclasses it, which is a shame because I'm mostly a giant weapon kind of guy. At least you get to test it out right then and there, which is nice. Wipe out the remaining Danes and the mission ends with villagers celebrating and you heading off to the ruins of Troy. Before 2-3 you max out all your upgrade bars, turning the Spartan into a hero. However, I'm not exactly sure what that does. I assume the second magic bar comes from maxing power, so all it seems to do is give the Spartan new threads. Anyway, into Troy, which is oddly advanced for a seemingly ancient civilization. Steam engines and pipes all over the place. The first half is pretty simple, but introduces the Praetorians. They are a more powerful faction of Romans, more durable, all wear purple, and add a nasty new unit, the great sword-wielding Carnifex, and good lord do you feel the ramp up in power. But what is an army without its leader? Aulus Sejanus, Praetorian Prefect, Sorcerer, right hand of the Emperor himself, and Grand Master of Entrances. Just look at this guy. He's also a man that likes to talk, which is great because I like to listen. He mocks Crassus for being a primitive idiot and explains how he will not be underestimating you like his deceased colleague, before putting his plan to kill you into practice, and to do that, He revives the dead. We have a British Roman necromancer tactician. Anywhere else this would feel a bit too much, but here it's the perfect step up from weaponized Medusa. Anyway, the undead. The undead are dumber, weaker, and a whole lot less durable than regular enemies. However, they have the advantage of being undead. Specifically, killing them isn't enough to kill them. You either have to execute them on the ground or hit them with any fire attacks you might have, which is codename for fire arrows. They also add in spawners in the forms of graves and coffin piles that infinitely generate enemies until you destroy them. They aren't difficult alone, but if you're not paying attention, you will get overrun and it will hurt. Blast your way through the undead hordes into the tomb of Achilles, and Sejanus is already there to taunt you. The spear has unfortunately already been claimed by another, your nemesis, an exact clone of the Spartan which he leaves you to fight. The battle is odd. Instead of a massive brawl, it's you and the nemesis in an empty room which spawns magic orbs sporadically. The gimmick is you have to grab them before he does, as he has access to both versions of the power of gods of the spear. You're hoping he does the stab because the game actually gives you the ability to block that move when you have one full magic gauge, which is neat. If completely underutilized mechanic, the game basically doesn't touch again after this fight. If he uses it to self-immolate, just run. You can't hit him, his attacks go through your shield and set you on fire, doing damage over time. The fight isn't bad, but it feels a bit bland. The game isn't set up for 1v1 duels really, and it just feels like a bit of a slap fight. But eventually you beat your evil twin, completing the mission. Next mission starts with Sejanus taunting you and alluding that your friends are in danger, but that doesn't matter because you have the spear and it can do exactly everything it could do in the hands of the nemesis, which makes it stupidly good against the undead, which is what you'll be fighting a lot of. It's also the last new weapon of the game, which isn't particularly well paced considering we're only halfway through the game. However, outside of the game introducing the Praetorian Assassins, which can just sod off, mission isn't anything to write home about, but it gives us time to discuss gameplay. Now, contrary to what the developers intended, this game is a bit of a button basher. They didn't want to have any complex combos bogging down the fighting, but that just opens the game up to being bashing X repeatedly most of the time, which ultimately made the game more into a grounded Muso-like affair, which isn't actually a bad thing because the game is more grounded. The moment-to-moment combat never really gets stale. My issue with things like Dynasty Warriors and similar games is that you just feel like you're mindlessly charging around the map, slapping jobber enemies, and feeling a lot like a power fantasy. Not an indictment on the franchise or genre, it just doesn't do anything for me. Spartan Total Warrior, however, it's less like a shiny golden god versus hordes of disposable enemies, and more like a trained army versus another trained army that just so happens to have a more trained soldier with magic god weapons. Additionally, it's a generally slower pace, but the scale of the skirmishes and the implementation of rage actually helps the combat flow more smoothly, with distinct high points to break up any possible monotony. And as I said previously, the moderate lulls between encounters stop the action from getting too samey and burning the player out on constant action. And while the combat is basic, it remains entertaining the entire runtime, helped in no small part by the weight of everything. Attacks on all sides have impact, the feedback of which goes a long way to make the game feel quite visceral. It's an important aspect for hack and slash games, and Spartan Total Warrior absolutely nailed the assignment. One thing it didn't nail, however, was the voice acting, as highlighted by the mission ending where Sejanus tells the gang that this was all a diversion to let the Roman army take Sparta. Just listen.
And the whole of Greece is now a dominion of the Roman Empire.
No! You're lying!
Don't be too hard on yourself, Spartan. No one could have stopped me.
You'll pay for this, Sejanus, if it's the last thing I do.
No, Spartan. The last thing you do will be to die.
Jason Isaacs, the voice of Sejanus, is carrying this game's voice acting on his goddamned back. On to the next mission, and it is the shortest in the entire game, because it is only a single boss fight against the Hydra. It's a giant boss, which is always an alarm bells moment, but they managed to make it not tedious and awful. You have to bait the heads into attacking you, hopefully with it aiming between the pillars so that you can power a god stab it, blowing its head clean off. Then, as a clever and neat touch, you have to use fire arrows which spawn on either side of the platform to cauterize the stump, which in this specific case destroys the rest of the neck, which is a cool way of handling the Hydra head thing. Granted, as the fight continues, more heads appear and it gives you less time to deal with each one until the main head appears, and outside the bigger head breathing fire, it continues as normal. It's not super deep, but it's faster and more interactive than a lot of similar fights. I've also got to give props to the Hydra's design for shirking the traditional draconic look most go with in favour of something much more monstrous and alien. With Sparta gone and the gang without a home, they head to Athens in search of the resistance there, and this leads us to the absolute worst mission in the entire game. If 2-2 was a wall, 2-6 is the goddamn Alps. The mission on paper is simple. You have to make sure Archimedes, this idiot, doesn't die. He's trying to rally the Athenian people against the Roman occupation, and the Romans obviously aren't fans of that, so doing all they can to silence him, and by silence we mean brutal assassination. First stage is archers and the occasional assassin, which further cements my hatred of the enemy type. Also, Archie seems very lax about the whole staying alive thing. Second stage, the Romans send full cohorts to stop the gathering, and you have to stop them. Thankfully, there are Spartan soldiers hanging out in a local bar that you can use to help balance the numbers. Why are they there? Stop asking. More standard fare for the game, which is nice because what comes next is where things start to ramp up a bit. There are spies in the crowd and you have to stop them from reaching their safe houses, otherwise it's game over. They are escorted by a couple of soldiers, which ramps up over time to assassins. Yay! Also archers in the wall, because naturally. Now, this doesn't sound bad, but your allies have just disappeared and you have to do all of this on your own. Additionally, they start sending out multiple spies at a time, and you have to track down each one through this maze of a level. And then afterwards, you have to take out all the remaining escorts that you missed originally, and without the Spartans to act as aggro sponges, it's a bit tricky, but nothing truly soul-crushing. No, that would be the final gauntlet, where you have to escort Archimedes himself to his own safe house, and oh, merciful heaven! But at least before that starts, there's a checkpoint and a brief respite where you can clean up all the side objectives, including drawing funny moustaches on the posters of the Emperor, which is silly, but a good bit of levity before the absolute hell to come. So, you have to protect Archimedes as he walks around Athens, without a care that people want him dead, and you just have to make sure that doesn't happen. Again, you have to do this without assistance from allies, but good news, they won't just solely target the Spartan. That's because they will be too busy beating the crap out of this old man, and shockingly, he's as durable as paper. This is further compounded by the game throwing some of the nastiest enemy combinations at you, a highlight of which is a unit consisting of a Carnifex and a handful of assassins. Additionally, these enemies will also ambush you repeatedly, meaning you almost always are doing it at a disadvantage, especially if you haven't been rationing out the Hell Shrines for this entire mission. Because they do not respawn or recharge, and if you have a rough few sections, like I did, this mission is a nightmare. You either die a lot, or Archie dies a lot, and if you're really unlucky, you die right at the end of the mission, because you have no health the entire time. It can be an absolutely miserable experience, and will most likely end up being a 2 to 3 hour slog if things go south. And things will go south. While I do hate this section, as a lot of people do, as can be attested by the number of guides online, let me play devil's advocate a bit, because I absolutely see what they're going for here. You're in a Roman-occupied city after splitting from your allies and you're basically all alone. It's supposed to be a struggle to make you feel the pressure. However, it is such a departure from what the game normally plays like, it just goes a bit too far into frustrating. And I'm pretty sure just having like 5 allies for the Archimedes escort would have alleviated most of that frustration. But ultimately, this mission feels like a bit of a blemish on an otherwise solid gaming experience. In stark contrast, the next mission is a pretty slow affair that consists of running around Athens, recruiting ladies in the night, sneaking into a temple, and breaking into Archimedes' villa, where he has kept his death ray. Again, this isn't historically accurate. But this ultimately makes the mission weirdly long, which gives us time to talk about the game's plot, or lack thereof. The plot can be summed up with 2 words. Fight Romans. Fight Romans, fight more Romans, fight magic weapon to help fight Romans, fight even more Romans, and anything between you and said Romans. Shakespeare, this is not. It's not altogether deep or compelling, but that actually plays in its advantage. Rather than being an epic narrative, each mission ends with the answer, fight Romans, and then goes on to ask how. It is the primary driving force of the Spartans' actions, and every mission objective exists to propel that to its natural endpoint. Sometimes having a bare-bones story is the best thing you can possibly do. That said, it does cause a few issues in the future, and we'll get there when they come up. Speaking of the endpoint, this mission ends with the assault on the villa, and the knockdown drag-out fight that is. This game handles siege scenarios really well if you can't tell. This is such a hectic experience, and it isn't all that hard because it truly returns to the army versus army combat. But some consideration has to be given to Sejanus, who spends the entire time summoning fireball turrets and shooting his magical machine gun at you. Not a joke, by the way. Mission ends as the gang corners a pissed off Sejanus, who teleports away so you can activate the death ray. Mission 3-2 is also pretty simple. You climb the comically large tower in the villa to activate the sun collectors for the death ray, which is simple enough. Right up until Sejanus rocks up on a skeletal dragon. Don't ask where he got it. Dude knows how to make an entrance. Pollux is awful at insults though.
Hey, Sejanus! Your mother's even uglier than you!
Sejanus functions similar to the assault, shooting his magical machine gun, and you have to clear the Romans that flood in so you can escape and head to the next collector. And this continues for the majority of the mission, with the only new thing before the boss being the introduction of the Inferni, aka flamethrower soldiers, somehow weirdly less believable than the skeletal dragons. And these guys are either the easiest enemies in the game or the most frustrating, depending on if they get an attack in or not. And like the Spartan sappers, they explode on death, unless you Medusa them, further proving Medusa's shield superiority. Reach the roof, activate the last of the collectors, and start the fight with Ladon, which is a turret section. I would say in its defense that you're fighting a dragon as a dude, but you just fought the Hydra 3 missions ago, so they could have done something else, but I think they really wanted the Archimedes laser gun to be important. After downing the dragon, Electra joins the gang as they square up to Sejanus, right before Pollux dies in a stupid 1v1 and is revived as a zombie, and this would have had more of an impact if he wasn't the least interesting character in the game and had any emotional attachment. First downside of the basic story, no one really gets developed, so what you see is what you get for better or worse, in this case the latter. Now the fight with Sejanus is kind of boring. All he does is teleport around, fire his laser gun, spawn his fireballs, and everything he's already done before. He also has a shield that activates as he's firing, and while it's down he's vulnerable to attack, but can also hit you with his own sword. So the time he's actually damageable is very short. And honestly, it's a massive disservice to the best character in the game. You beat him, and Pollux the zombie dies with him, and the gang mourn his passing. Moving swiftly on, we get the final upgrades and unlock the legend status. Still not entirely sure what it does outside of the dope leopard skin and shoulder dealies, but you'll need it because Castor and the Spartan are assaulting the gates of Saturn, the only way through the Alps to Rome. Assuming, of course, a trip across the ocean was out of the question, and we didn't want another dope siege mission, which we definitely do. I also want to quickly draw attention to the Spartan and his now massive beard. This game has been somewhat awkward about the timescale of events, as we've just been going from mission to mission without any real time seemingly passing. This, however, this is a neat and sadly rather missable detail that easily covers that they've been at this campaign a while. And isn't getting any easier because as the third to last mission of the game, the Gates of Saturn is decently long and difficult to boot. Firstly, the Spartan has to clear out 2 outposts shredding his forces, followed by using the ballista to destroy the sally points on the fortress outer walls. And true to form, there is a lot going on. You're dodging volleys of arrows, ballista shots, explosives thrown from catapults as you complete these objectives, all while your army charges headlong into the fray. It's not timed or anything, but the game piles on the carnage. There is such a sense of urgency that it feels like there should be. Scale the walls, blast through the main gate, then you have to escort your sappers through to the courtyard to destroy the next wall. The assault on the wall was messy, but this fight is just chaos. Soldiers flooding in from multiple sides, archers peppering your men with arrows from another, and topped off with the second best beat drop in the entire game. And after clearing that, 50 soldiers are poised to meet you in the next courtyard, and after beating them, archers flood in with the primary goal of turning the Spartan army into pincushions. It goes contrary to my previous statement of highs and lows of action, but it actually works in this case because you're attacking a fortified position with zero previous knowledge and everything is set up to rip you a new one. But eventually you do get your lull as you open the next gate, to be greeted by none other than Sejanus, back from the dead. Necromancers, it seems, are pretty hard to kill, especially when he planned for this. And because he's back, you know what that means? Zombie time! And this is much harder than any previous times because it's a smaller arena, regular enemies start piling in, and the Inferni are much harder to get to. Also, you're on your own again, which follows a 1v100 style gauntlet towards the lever that opens the way for your soldiers. It's rough, but it's oh so much fun at the same time. Open the gate and Sejanus, in a fit of plot-contrived stupidity, brings attention to the priestesses located on the roofs, declaring them the source of his power so you know what's next on the menu. They have to be defeated in order, with each one opening the path to the next in classic video game style. But uncommonly for Spartan Total Warrior, there are various outcrops and hidden paths that lead to secrets for all you completionists out there. Also, the path to the priestess is just a gravity playground, so get your "this is Sparta" kicks out of your system, you've earned it. The fights themselves are visually pretty cool, where they teleport you to an astral realm where you lose all of your magic and have to fight them au naturel. There's also an Inferni here for some reason, and gravity is turned coat on you. That said, the fights themselves are pretty lame as they devolve into waiting for the shield to go down, shooting them with your bow, and waiting again. And you do this 3 more times with gradually more priestesses to fight. But after that, the way to Sejanus is opened. And Sejanus himself is really disappointing. It's a rehash of the last fight with him, only with the addition of more zombies. No intro cutscene, no death cutscene, nothing. He just dies and the mission ends and the Spartan and caster console over Pollux. Again, they really fumble the fights with Sejanus. You'd expect so much more out of the game's longest running antagonist instead of the equivalent of a wet fart. Something somewhat interesting is that once you reach Legend status at the start of 3.3, you're maxed out on upgrades. However, the game still loads you into the screen to do the upgrades. I'm not sure if it's an oversight or not because it's also where your inventory is held, but it seems kind of superfluous at this point. After breaking the gates of Saturn, the game immediately drops you into the cartoonishly large video game aqueducts of Rome, complete with instant death pits and poison gas vents. But it's sadly kind of unmemorable outside of that, and the second slow-mo power-up of the entire game. And like the first one that I didn't mention, it's just in a random place in the map. Otherwise it feels artificially long due to squads of nothing but assassins and carnifexes, which you fight all solo. Death will occur. But we can use this time to talk about the game's OST, because it's kind of not what you'd have expected at face value. What you'd probably have expected is something orchestral, maybe some Greco-Roman drum music, and whilst those are there, it's fused with techno. A lot of techno. And beyond expectations, it really, really works. The drum and the orchestral stuff is stuck on the stealth sections and other quieter moments, and then they pull out the techno for the really heated battles. But don't take my word for it. Have some examples. Hell, even the Archimedes Gauntlet has perfect music for the mission, because it's weirdly unbalancing. It's just another thing that Team Spartan got extremely right. What they didn't get right, however, was the boss of this mission. The Minotaur at the end of the aqueduct is kind of awful. The idea is you're supposed to lure it into the pillars that have bombs next to them to detonate them. The issue with that is the arena is bloody massive. It becomes really awkward to direct it to the pillars, so you end up just trying to wet noodle the thing whilst endless Romans stream into the room. It's kind of not great, but at least Ares seems pleased. The final mission is short but intense. While the Spartan has been bombing it in the aqueduct, Electra and Castor assaulted Rome directly, which went not great as you'd expect with only 40 dudes. Save them both before the timer runs out, then you have to fight your way up the Colosseum to reach the Emperor to end this. There isn't anything new about this mission, as is common for a lot of final missions, but it does have its moments, especially dropping into the Colosseum itself while a massive brawl goes on between the gladiators and the soldiers, whilst Death and Destruction starts playing. I am now realising they use that song a lot, but it works every time, so I just don't care. You reach the Emperor, and he's an absolute wet lettuce. Tells the Spartan that he was only following orders, throws a knife at him, and then jumps to his death yelling that he knows. Whatever that means. Oh right, Ares. So turns out, Ares set this whole thing up. The invasion of Greece, the destruction of Sparta, you coming to Rome for revenge. But why? For what purpose? Well, as it turns out, the Spartan is the son of the handmaiden that revealed Ares' affair with Aphrodite to Hephaestus. Ares killed the handmaid, the gods banished Ares, and then hid Spartan with the Spartans after imbuing him with supernatural powers and skill, but also taking his memories to keep him safe from Ares. And all of this was for Ares to kill him and complete his revenge. Which is really excessive, but speaks to the capriciousness of the Greek gods, but that's not the issue. The issue is the last time the whole amnesia plotline was raised was at the very start of the game. We have been going maybe 14 hours with nothing but kill Romans, and that's worked fine. More than fine, honestly. That for them to bring this plotline back again really kind of falls flat because you've most likely forgotten it exists. That said, the fight with Ares is actually the hardest in the game and tests everything you know. This dude has a lot of moves, as you could guess from the literal god of war. He blocks attacks, is basically immune to magic, counters your attacks with a throw if your combo goes too long. He can also revive the dead, clone himself, and shoot explosive flame trails at you. And it's really, really hard. Right up until you realise the trick is to shield bash him, combo him until you have rage, use it to dodge his grab, and basically repeat until he's defeated. But it's still a pretty solid fight that just abruptly ends. And when it does, so does the game with Castor gassing up the Spartan until the credits roll. The game gets very abrupt in its transitions in the later stages. Not sure I like that. As the final curtain has fallen on the game, it's time for my closing thoughts. This game is really fun. It's mechanically basic, the story's a bit bare bones, and the bosses outside of Crassus, Ares and the Hydra aren't amazing. And some of the missions are absolute walls that can turn away even the most stalwart of players, but good lord, does it do so much right. Basic though it is, the combat is satisfying, it's weighty, and can't just be mindlessly spammed through. and the sheer scale of everything is unlike anything consoles have done at the time, and I would argue has rarely been done since. This game was a true labour of love, and while they didn't get Total War on consoles, they got the next best thing. What do you think? What are your thoughts on Spartan Total Warrior if you've played it? The same? Better? Worse? Let me know in the comments, and like and subscribe if you enjoyed. I have been the Resident Gremlin, and I'll see you next time.